Great, let's talk about how we engage with empirical research studies. Here is the module outline if you want to hit the pause button so you can set up your notes. So to begin, what is the role of previous studies in research? So when we as researchers are going to conduct a research study, or we have an idea for a research study, we don't just jump into a project because we think it sounds interesting or fun or cool. Instead, research is built on decades of previous research and theory. When someone decides that they want to do a study about something, they really have to know what else other people have already found out on this topic or related topics. So they do something called a literature review. And when we say literature, we mean previous studies. A literature review will answer the question, is this study worth doing? Has someone else already looked at this exact same topic? Is there remaining things to know on this topic? It also allows you to show that your project is going to be meaningful and add to the body of knowledge, that it will be a contribution. It also creates a framework that you can set up, what are the major themes on this topic, what have other people already found, and also can create benchmarks. So if previous research that measured exercise, for example, found that on average college students exercise 5 hours a week or something, that allows you in your research study of college students exercising to be able to compare your findings to other findings. So this is a really important part of what researchers do. And in fact, researchers spend a lot of time just keeping up with the literature, reading new studies all the time, because it would be unfortunate if you did an entire research study and it turns out that nobody cares. So you have to do your literature review first. So what types of studies exist out there? The first thing are empirical studies. And when we say the word empirical, that means that there was a data-based research study in the paper. It's not an essay or a thought piece, that there was some data that was collected and analyzed. When we say empirical study, we usually mean a single study that had a couple hypotheses or research questions, between 3 and 5, on a narrow topic. They are not broad at all. You're not going to see an empirical study on children and sleep. It's always on these very specific questions. Empirical research is based on observed or measured phenomenon with an explicit method. And in general, and we'll talk about this in a minute, there is a very clear format to how these studies are organized, with a research question or hypothesis proposed and then data that are analyzed. So that's an empirical study. Those are like a one-off study. Systematic reviews are super useful, and they are a review of all or many of the empirical studies on a particular topic. So they are not collecting data themselves. They are taking the results from a bunch of other studies and summarizing it. And the point of these is to understand the overall patterns on a topic. And these are incredibly useful. So if you were like, I'm really curious what the deal is with social media and body image, if you found a good systematic review, it's going to save you a ton of time, because somebody else who really thinks about this topic all the time summarized all the research for you. And it will say, there's disagreements about this and this. We find that things are different for adolescents versus adults. And so these are just amazing. A specific type of systematic review that is really cool is a meta-analysis. In a meta-analysis, they actually get the statistical results, and sometimes even the data, from many, many empirical studies. It could be 20 studies, it could be hundreds of studies. And they take all those results and they reanalyze them statistically to be able to develop broader conclusions. So for example, let's say we were looking at the effect of social media on body image. They collect 300 studies on this, and they are able to say, in these 300 studies that each had, a few hundred participants, this is what in combination they found. So, like a systematic review, it's incredibly valuable, and especially because one single study could have some problems or could lack internal, external validity. It could be a one-off, it could be exceptional, there could be something really funny that happened in that study. When you have a systematic review or a meta-analysis, it's far more powerful to understand things. I'll give you an example. Recently, the Seattle Public Schools decided that they wanted to sue a bunch of social media companies because they said that social media is making kids have mental health issues. And they cited one or two studies to demonstrate their point. But those studies, I assume they didn't know, have been highly criticized for not having very good methods. And if you look at meta-analyses and systematic reviews on this topic, it actually says that the effect that social media has on children's mental health is very small. It's always in very specific cases. While there are some concerns, in general, there's not a strong linkage. But just because that one single study said the opposite, it was used in this court case. So when you are out there thinking about research, always be looking for meta-analyses and systematic reviews first. They are going to be much more useful, especially if you are not a researcher that is inside of the current conversations on a topic. So where do we find research? Well, research exists all over the place, but a lot of research is in scholarly journals. And scholarly journals have a long tradition, and you can imagine them as like an ongoing conversation between scholars in these scholarly journals. And so when people publish studies, they're responding to older research. They are making sure that their research is literally in conversation with other research. In these scholarly journals, they have an editor who is themselves a senior scholar in the general area, and they include this thing called peer review. Peer review is essential as a credibility cue for any sort of research that you see. If you find a research study that was just done by, for example, a local nonprofit organization, it's very nice. It doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. But because it didn't undergo peer review, it's not considered as valid. Peer review means that outside experts, they're either called reviewers or referees, evaluate a research paper before it's published. These are very detailed. When I do a review, and I do about one review a month, depending on what's going on. When I do a review, I might spend 5, 6, 7, 8 hours reading their study very, very closely. And if it seems like there's problems, I might spend more. So 3 to 5 experts will do this for every study, and then they give feedback to the author that they'll say, I needed more information about the sampling method that you used. I was surprised to see that you didn't mention this particular reference. You probably should talk about that research. And this process usually goes through at least 2 or 3 back and forths between these anonymous reviewers and anonymous author. The editor is the one that is facilitating all this conversation. And those reviewers decide if that article is going to be published in the journal or not. So that sort of process means that for good journals, it's very, very hard to get published in them. This process also in communication can take about a year, this back and forth, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, but not often, because you need time for people who already are busy to be reading these studies. So this incredibly rigorous process matters a lot for credible research. Another thing to consider when we're looking at journals is the prestige of the journal. This is hard for people who are not in that community to be able to judge. So what determines if a journal is prestigious? If a lot of people want to publish in it, if it's hard to get things published in it, like I mentioned. In general, if it's associated with a scholarly association, that's a pretty good sign that it's credible. You can also check to find out if something's peer-reviewed and if it seems like it's legitimate. At the University of Washington, on the library page, you can go to this thing called Ulrich's Web that will tell you, is it peer-reviewed, how long has it existed, etc. If you're not at UW, you can use this Sky Mago website, and I'm going to show you some screenshots from that in a minute that will help you with some credibility cues. Like I said, there's places where research is published that are other places, but it isn't as credible as a peer-reviewed journal, and so you have to be more skeptical about it. Also, another unfortunate thing is a lot of research is in these scholarly journals which are not free. Some of them are, and they're called open access journals, or there will be articles in a journal that are open access for the public, but a lot of them you have to have a library subscription to read. This is a big problem. I won't go into it, but there seems to be no easy solutions to this. So how does someone who's not at a university access research? Well, public libraries like Seattle Public Library can have access, and you can look that way. Also, if you search in Google Scholar, you're going to watch a video about Google Scholar in this module. Sometimes scholars have posted PDFs of their studies online, like on their personal website, or earlier versions, like a draft version of the study that are more freely available. So if you search there or you search for the title, you can sometimes find it. Also, if you just search for the title on Google, sometimes you can find a PDF as well. Also, you can email the author. 99.9% of times, if you email an author and say, can you please send me a PDF of this study, they will send it to you immediately. People want you to read their work. They're happy to help you. That's a great way to get studies. Also, as I mentioned, open access. You can always just try to limit yourself to open access research. So this is the Sky Mago website I was mentioning. That is open to the public. And so if you type in there a particular journal, in this case I typed Journal of Communication, it will show you some credibility cues. It'll tell you what country it's published in, how long it's existed. So with the Journal of Communication, 1951, and then their last information they had about it was 2021, but obviously it still exists. And who publishes it, there's a homepage, email address for the editor, and this thing that's called an H-index. An H-index for a journal is a calculation of the journal's number of articles that have received a certain number of citations. So in this case, 143 articles in the Journal of Communication has received at least 143 citations. The higher the H-index, the better. There's also H-index that's associated with individual scholars. That is a similar calculation, but this is an H-index for the journal itself. The graphs that are on the left side of the screen, that is some like data about the Journal of Communication. That in general, this probably wouldn't be that relevant to you. It's more relevant if you want to publish in it, but it shows you this SJR ranking. It's basically a credibility ranking. You can see over the years it's always been pretty high. It shows you how many citations there have been versus self-citations. So if a journal is only citing within itself, that's a bad sign that it might be a fake journal. They show you like the proportion of manuscripts that have been cited by others versus not, international collaborations, this sort of thing. So all this kind of signifies to you that this looks legitimate. So this could be a really good way to check credibility. Also on that Sky Mago site, you can click on journal rankings, and you can see here I picked social sciences and communication, and it ranks the top communication journals. And it shows you all this sort of thing. Like here for communication methods and measures, it's a journal about measurement. It shows you like how many references it's received, how many total citations over 3 years, etc. Digital journalism, it's a newer journal, but you can see it's had a lot of references. And you can see New Media and Society is a very popular journal, lots of references to it. You can see where it's published, etc. So this can be, if you are not sure what's up with a journal, definitely go to the SkyMago site, paste it in, and see what you can learn about it. For finding studies while you're a UW student, the library is your best possible resource. The librarians are wonderful, they want to help you, and they're available 24 hours, 7 days a week to help you. If you go to the library website and you click on Ask Us, there's someone there to live chat with you at any moment. So if you're doing research for a paper or something and you have a question, just ask them. They're there. The communication department has its own librarian too that can help you. You can set up an appointment with them and talk through things. If you're doing a research paper, you should definitely use these. They're going to help you a lot. Now, if you're actually trying to search to find a study, some things to consider. One is your keywords need to be both precise and flexible. So for example, if you're studying teenagers, a few results might come up, but adolescence is the term that's more often used by scientists, and you'll have a lot more results. So you always have to be thinking about multiple keywords for any particular topic. So if you wanted to see like studies on Fortnite, you're probably not going to have a ton of studies on Fortnite, but if you search like first-person shooter, you might. Terms like egotistical might not result in a lot, but narcissism will. Also, if you're doing a study about Twitter and you see a study that's on the same topic but on Instagram, you should still read it because the effects might be the same and it might be still useful for you. Okay, so in quantitative social science studies and many qualitative studies, the structure of an empirical study is going to follow this pattern like 99% of the time. And qualitative ones, I'd say like 80% of the time. A lot of social science studies follow APA style, which is the American Psychological Association. So even though communication isn't psychology, this is the common format. So I'm going to go through each section because once you understand why each section exists, you can navigate any empirical article that you find. And I will say that this is pretty similar to what medical studies look like. They're all pretty similar. So the first thing is the title. The titles usually tell you exactly what the study's about. They're usually pretty straightforward. Sometimes people try to have like a cute pun or something, but they're pretty straightforward. Now the abstract, these are going to be 120 words, sometimes 150 words. And this is always going to be publicly available, even if the article is behind a paywall. So you can always read the abstract before reading an article. The abstract is a concise summary that tells you the purpose of the study, the method they used, the main results, and the conclusions. There's no like secrets in here. These abstracts get entered into databases like PsycInfo and Communication Source so that when people are searching for an article on a specific topic, they can decide if a study is relevant to them before they read the whole thing. So now the abstract should not be your only source of information about a study, but it does help you figure out if this study is worth looking at or not. The next section is the introduction. It is not always labeled introduction, but it is the introduction. The introduction section provides the justification for the study. This is where authors introduce the general topic, the broader research question, and usually, although not always, you'll find the conceptual definitions in the introduction section. This is when they use these specialized definitions. So they are often introduced in the introduction. The literature review sometimes is woven into the introduction, sometimes it's a separate section. It just sort of depends on the journal and what the authors want to do. This is a summary of previous research on the topic that is building an argument to lead up to the particular hypothesis or research question that the current study is going to pose. Conceptual definitions are sometimes in here too, especially if there's a lot of conceptual definitions in a study. Hypotheses and research questions aren't exactly a separate section per se, but they are going to probably be at the end of the literature review section, so you know exactly what they're asking. Sometimes when studies have a lot of hypotheses, they'll kind of break the literature review into different sections, but the hypotheses and research questions are not a mystery. It'll be really obvious to you. Then the next section is methods section. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The results section, the discussion section, and references. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper into those in a minute. I want to show you this example. Here's an article that was in a comm journal, Human Communication Research, and I just want to show you where these sections are. So first, the title. It's always going to be at the top. It's going to be super clear who wrote it. It will be under it, but you'll see this. Tuning Out Tenderness, the influence of gender and friends on U.S. adolescents' emotional self-socialization via film selection and avoidance. And you can see here, this is the journal, the volume, the date of publication, and the page numbers. Okay, so even though nowadays we read these on the web and sometimes we just read them in regular text, there usually is a PDF file that has page numbers that is associated with the actual printed physical journal. And sometimes reading those PDFs is a little bit easier than reading on the web because they're nicely formatted with like the figures and the tables inside of it. The abstract, remember, it's going to be 120 words, maybe 150 words. And let's check this one out. Teen boys often face peer pressure to avoid quote-unquote feminine emotions, such as tenderness. Media selections may reflect such pressures and constitute emotional self-socialization into traditional gender roles. Now, these are a lot of concepts that probably they're going to define for us later. An online experiment, see they're telling us exactly what kind of study they did, an online experiment with 402 13 and 14-year-olds. So exactly who the population that was studied was, or the sample was, based on Knobloch Westerwick's CSAM model, tested hypotheses about gendered selection / avoidance of hostile and tender content. So they're telling us what they studied too. Randomized to imagine watching a film alone or with friends, teens rated their interest in different film emotions and their likelihood of viewing 8 films, pre-tested hostile or tender, and then selected and viewed 4 trailers. Boys versus girls and non-binary youth gave higher ratings to hostile films and lower ratings to tender films. So here we go. They're telling us exactly what happened. They set up an experiment. They had teens decide, they rated their interest in different film emotions and if they'd view some movies. And then they viewed 4 trailers. In this study, they looked at boys versus girls and non-binary youth. And the boys in this study rated hostile films higher and tender films lower than girls and non-binary youth. So they're telling us exactly what the results were. It's not a big mystery. Baseline tender affect, that's emotion, lower in boys versus girls and non-binary youths, negatively predicted number of hostile trailers viewed, and which in turn negatively predicted post-test tenderness, consistent with emotional self-socialization. Imagined viewing condition did not moderate gender differences except in post-hoc interactions with gender mix of friends. So they're telling us all the results too. So if you were looking up studies about kids' self-socialization and gender, this would probably work. Over here, you can see this is the introduction in the lit review. They don't have headers because that's just not the style of this journal, but you can see what they're going to talk about. Media as a resource for self-socialization. So like learning about things, media to learn about something. Gender identity and emotion. So they're going to give the review of the literature about what we know about gender identity and emotion. Media selections as emotional self-socialization into gender roles. That's going to be a little lit review of that. Summary, research gap, and the current study. So this will be the summary of all these previous sections. The research gap, probably like, hey, you know, people have studied this and this and this, but nobody has studied it like this before. So that's the gap that they're trying to fill. And the current study. So that's where they're going to propose their hypotheses and research questions. The next section is methods. And again, I'm going to go into more detail about that in a minute. Results is where the actual statistical analysis is. And then the discussion section, again, I'm going to go into more detail about this in a minute. Now, in this study, they also have supplementary material, which is probably like the actual list of movies and the questions they asked, data availability. Some studies are use open science and will say, here's our anonymized data that you can test and replicate our findings. They'll disclose if they received any funding to run this study. They'll disclose any conflicts of interest. Acknowledgments is often like, oh, we just want to thank so-and-so for giving us feedback on something. And then the reference section. So pretty much any article you encounter is going to have these sections. Okay, the methods section, this is super important. The goal of the methods section is to provide enough detail that if someone wanted to replicate this study, like do the exact same study themselves, they could. It should have everything. The operationalizations, the sampling plan, what exactly they did for analysis, how they did everything. The methods section is typically divided into 4 main subsections. I'm going to show you an example of this in a minute, but keep these in mind as we look through it. First, there's participants. This is describing who was in the study, how many people were in the study, or how many companies or entities or whatever, participants. Important demographic information. How many were in each condition if it's an experiment? Where they were sampled from? Were they compensated? What were the ethical considerations? Did they sign informed consent? This is very important for evaluating whether the sample makes sense for the claims being made. The next section, and sometimes there's different titles for this, but it's often called design. It'll describe the variables that were manipulated or measured. If it's an experiment, it will tell you about the level of the independent variables, and if it wasn't a within participants or between participants design. Sometimes this will get folded into the procedure section. The next section is materials, apparatus, sometimes called measures. It depends. In a psychology experiment, you might see an actual apparatus described, like the equipment or computers or videos used to present stimuli. In a survey study or a content analysis, this section's usually going to be called measures. This is going to tell you exactly the operational definitions and as well about the measurement validity and measurement reliability. Measurement validity is usually implied if it's an existing measure, but if it's a new measure, they will talk about how they've evaluated measurement validity. They will for sure talk about measurement reliability, even if it's an existing measure. They'll talk about within this sample and the data that was collected. Then procedure. This will give you a chronological ordering of what the participants actually experienced during the study, what instructions they got, what they saw or read, what tasks they performed, how they were assigned to conditions, all of that. Now, sometimes some of these things get combined, but all of this information will for sure be in there somewhere. Okay, so this is the PDF version of this article. I wanted to show you how this looks because it's a little bit different. You can see in this particular journal, they have 2 columns. So again, we have title, abstract. This is the introduction and the literature review. So you can see that. It's giving us a literature review, and you can see because of the way this particular journal is formatted, they have these hyperlinks here so that you can click on the original study. And then again, this was the summary, research gap, and the current study. And here are their hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, H1, boys versus girls and non-binary youths will report A, higher interest in hostile emotion, and B, lower interest in tender emotion. Okay? And then you can see they have the rest of these hypotheses. Okay? Methods. You see they have a big header here to show you. So the methods section has different ways that it can be formatted, just to be totally forthcoming with you. But there's usually a couple different sections that exist. One section usually is about the participants themselves. And we can see that that's down here. But this particular study started out explaining what their stimuli were. So this is an experiment, so they're explaining how they did this. So they say 12 film trailers were pre-tested with some undergraduates who rated them as hostile or tender. So it's giving a little bit of information about how they picked these particular setups. And then they say the study. Power analysis, we've talked about before with sampling. They talk about how they use G-power to determine what their sample size was, which was minimum of 388. And now we get into the common section, participants. So the participants section describes who was in the study, how many people, important demographic condition, where they were sampled from. This is very important to evaluate, to say, is the sample that they collected a good enough samples that we can say that, in fact, this study is well done and that we believe its results. So this says there were 431 13 and 14-year-olds recruited from Qualtrics, which is an online polling company that we've talked about before as these online recruiting. 27 were dropped for failing Qualtrics' quality checks, for missing or straight line responses and or low response times. Good. And either of 2 attention check questions. We'll talk more about attention checks when we get into surveys and experiments. 2 participants didn't report their friends' genders, which they needed for post hoc analyses, so they were removed. So they ended up having 402. You can see here, this is part of ethics. As approved by the author's institutional review board, parents granted consent via the online consent page. Then teens gave assent, which we've talked about, and completed the study. So parents gave consent and the teens themselves assented. Teens were compensated, so this is another ethical concern, in accordance with Qualtrics policy. Now, they're not telling us here what that is to pay, they're getting paid, which would be nice to know, but somehow we know that these teens were compensated for their time. Sample quotas were used to get roughly even distributions for age, race, ethnicity, and gender. So sample quotas here, in the supplementary material, they have more details about it, but we've talked about quota sampling before. This is commonly done on these online panels. So this is a lot of details. This looks good. This is, these are kids who have access to the internet, so they're not necessarily perfectly representative of all 13 and 14-year-olds, and they're kids whose parents have signed them up or allowed them to sign up for this participation in a study. So maybe not exactly like your average 13 and 14-year-old, but as we'll talk about with experiments later, that's okay. In experiments, we're not necessarily looking for a perfectly representative sample because we're testing between groups, and in this case, between genders. So next section is procedures. Sometimes this will be called design, depending, and this is just telling us what exactly they did in this study. So in this case, teens reported their demographics with baseline emotional. Teens were randomized to 2 conditions. Were you watching this movie alone or with friends? They tell you the prompt. The kids rated how interested they were in the movie. Teens rated the likelihood of watching the film. And after they watched this movie trailer, they re-rated their emotional attributes. The kids also answered questions about their friend group and recent media use. Those assigned to imagine viewing with friends, answer the question about friends after they viewing instructions. Those that they weren't supposed to imagine they were viewing with friends, didn't. We're going to talk about this more when we talk about experiments, but all teens completed manipulation checks and emotional tone of films. Okay. Measures. Sometimes this will be called like items or something, but in general, they are going to tell us exactly how they measured stuff. This is important for transparency and replicability. And you can see here, they're like, you can get our full questionnaire on this website, but they're telling us exactly how things were measured. At both pre-test and post-test, 6 items measured hostility. And these items so this is the concept and these are the dimensions: aggressive, angry, assertive, dominant, mean, and tough. Here, they're giving this alpha. They're telling us how correlated these 6 hostility items were. So here, in the pre-test, it was 0.72. That's pretty highly correlated. In the post-test, 0.8. Again, tenderness had affection, compassion, sympathetic, tender, warm. They were correlated 0.84 or 0.86, and this alpha here tells us that they're looking at what's the relationship between these. Items were selected based on existing measures, which we know. don't worry about this stuff. That's fine. So they measured that stuff. They also measured, so you see how there's like subheaders for each of this, pre and post test emotional attributes. So these are emotional attributes they measured. Gender, mix of friends. They asked if you were watching a movie with friends, how many friends would it be, from 0 to 6 or more? So this is good because this is an example of a ratio measure, right? They said, well, it's ratio up to 6. Said, if you were going to be watching a movie with friends, how many friends would be there? And the number that were boys, girls, non-binary, same age, older, and younger. So these are more nominal variables, right? Because it's like, are they boys, girls, non-binary, same age, older, and younger? That would be an ordinal measure, the being like younger, same age, older, right? And it's ordinal because they're not equidistant. Younger, same age, and older aren't equidistant from each other. Also, how do you know them, etc. So these are nominal variables. These are probably what they're just using for controls. So then interest in film emotions, they asked them, how interested would you be in watching a movie that is, and then it has all these different emotions. 1, not interested at all. 5, extremely interested. And so this is a good example of a interval Likert scale. So we're going to treat it as if the 1 through 5 were equidistant from each other, even though we know that they, in reality, they probably aren't. So they're going through here, and then they also asked them rated likelihood of viewing hostile and tender film. So they asked them, look here, on a 3-point scale, no, maybe, or yes, if they'd see this film. And I assume that they treated this as ordinal. Okay, and then number of hostile trailers viewed, and so it was a ratio 0 to 4. So those are all the different sections in a method section. That is going to be done very commonly.
I do want to talk about conceptual and operational definitions because this is going to come up on quizzes, exams, and different assignments. We've talked about conceptual and operational definitions before, but where do you find them in an empirical study? Conceptual definitions, what a concept means in a general theoretical sense, is going to be in the introduction or the literature review. So if a study is about parasocial relationships, the authors will explain parasocial relationships are ... and they will give you the conceptual definition, usually citing someone else. It's pretty rare that in a study they'll just make up their own conceptual definition. I will say within psychology specifically, there are some exceptions to this because in psychology, a lot of things are standardized, right? Like the particular measure for depression or for anxiety. These have particular conceptual and operational definitions from the DSM, like the Diagnostic Handbook. So in psychology, they might not give the actual conceptual or operational definition because it's so clear to them. If they say the UCLA loneliness scale, that everybody knows what exactly that concept is, what its dimensions are, and how it's measured. But within comm studies and other social science studies, you will for sure find these. If it's not obvious to you, you might have to do a search within the document to try to find it. So if you search for the word, eventually you will come across it. Now, operational definitions. This is how the concept was actually measured in the study. This will be in the methods section under materials or measures. The operational definition will be the specific scale or questionnaire that the participants filled out to measure parasocial relationships, for example. Within an experiment, if the independent variable was some sort of stimuli, like some of the kids were watching a movie and others read a book, they will also explain somewhere in the methods section what exactly they did. For example, if they're like, well, the movie version was this long and the book version was this long, and we made sure they were similar in these ways, they'll explain it. In a content analysis study, they will explain exactly how something was measured. So for example, if they are looking for like a character exhibiting signs of masculinity, they will explain exactly what they meant and how they tested for reliability. So this is very, very helpful in terms of being able to be transparent so that people can engage in replication. So conceptual definitions, you might have to search around for a little bit. Operational should be super duper obvious. Then you will come across the results section. And this can be scary to look at. This is where the authors tell you how they actually analyze the data. This could be quantitative, it could be qualitative. If it's quantitative, it could be really advanced statistics, but don't be intimidated by it. You just skim through the heavy statistical notation and look in the text. Usually at the bottom of the results section, authors will write plainly what they found. You'll also see summary information in tables and graphs. And if you're having trouble with it, don't stress out about it. At the top of the discussion section, they will certainly give a summary of what was found, and that information will also be in the abstract.
I want to walk you through a little bit about the results section. In general, you don't need to worry about the results section. They're doing statistical analyses that you really don't need to worry about, but I do want to just show you how they usually are set up. In the results section, they say, these are the statistical tests we used. Then they talk about how they had some manipulation checks, which we're going to talk about when we talk about experiments, randomization checks, between film differences. Descriptive statistics, which we're going to talk about later, are like the basic averages, standard deviations for what people watched. Then they tell us about each hypothesis. So they're going to tell us what exactly tests they ran. So this is for a specific hypothesis, and they tell us the mean, standard deviations. You can see here that they have a table that they show all of this stuff, and then these little stars imply that there were statistically significant differences between results. They're now saying H1 predicted that boys versus girls and non-binary youth would report a higher interest in hostile emotion and a lower interest in tender. They're saying, yes, that was true, and they give us the statistics. But again, don't worry about it. You can see that each of the hypotheses has gone through. They also show it in a visual so you can see that they're doing a comparison, and you're like, I see here that there is, you can see a physical difference between the boys and then the girls and non-binary youth. And here you can really see a big difference. They demonstrated their model, which people don't always do, but it's a nice way just to see how different variables are related to each other, and each of these lines is a hypothesis. And here, a post hoc analysis is an analysis that they do after the fact, where they were looking at specifically about gender mix of friends. So they're giving results on that. Yeah. Okay, so that is what the results section looks like.
Okay, once you get to the discussion section, this is the best part. The discussion section reviews the hypotheses or the research questions that were stated in the introduction and discusses the results in reference to the original bigger picture research question or goal. It should be extremely clear from the discussion what answer the study provided. The authors will also compare their findings with results from past studies and provide explanation for anything that was surprising or unexpected. Results sections will include limitations. This can be kind of off-putting for people because it might make you think, wow, this study was really bad. Don't think that. The limitation section is a good sign of transparency. Limitation sections will say things like, well, we could have had a more diverse sample, or we asked people if they like chocolate or vanilla ice cream. We probably should have had more choices than that, whatever. Just because an author is saying what didn't go well doesn't mean the study is bad. Remember that a principle of science is being self-critical, so this just happens. The authors usually will also suggest directions for future studies, which can be really useful if you're looking for a research topic for yourself. You'll also see the reference section. Every past study, cited papers, they should be in there for alphabetical order. This is a gold mine for finding more research. If you read a great study, look at their references to find other relevant articles. There are different ways to do citations within a communication. The APA, American Psychological Association, is the default. Also, I want to mention that sometimes studies have multiple studies within it. This is more common in psychology, and usually it will be introduction, method 1, results 1, method 2, results 2, and then a general discussion. This isn't terribly common in communication, but if you see it, just to let you know. One other part that comes after the discussion and conclusion, but before the references, is a section that will give some disclosure information. So within that, they will talk about things like if there are anyone that they want to thank, like a research assistant or someone that helped. They'll also talk about if they received any funding. They also will give a conflict of interest disclosure, which we've talked about is important to pay attention to, and you'll see some examples of that in a moment.
Okay, the discussion section. This is where things get really interesting. Now, some studies will have a separate conclusion and discussion. Some merge discussion and conclusion together. It really just depends on how things are set up. So this section will review the hypotheses that were stated in the introduction and lit review, and they're going to discuss the results in reference to the original bigger research question. It should be very clear from the discussion section what answer the study provided, and authors are going to compare their findings with findings from past studies, previous studies, to explain any surprising or unexpected results, okay? And there's subsections in here first. Discussion sections usually open with a paragraph that kind of gives a summary of what they found. This project examined young teen selection and avoidance of hostile and tender emotion in film. They used this framework. We conceptualized this stuff would reflect and reinforce gender pressures related to emotional experience and expression, such as male avoidance of tenderness. To our knowledge, it's our first study to examine teen boys' self-socialization away from tenderness and consider how selections might vary by the imagined presence of friends as co-viewing partners. So you can see here, it explains what exactly they did, and they say what their findings were. So if you're looking for the findings, this is a great place to look for them. Our findings consistently supported the hypothesized effects of gender. Boys, compared to girls and non-binary youth, reported more interest in hostile emotions and less interest in tender emotions, rated themselves more likely to watch hostile pre-tested films and less likely to watch the tender pre-tested films, etc. And then, now here you can see, we also predicted that these gender differences would be larger for teens that were imagined to be viewing with their friends versus viewing alone. But they say, in fact, we did not find viewing conditions moderated gender effects. So these hypotheses were not supported, which is okay. They're being transparent about it. But they said, but we did some post hoc analyses and we found some other stuff. So here they are speculating why their hypotheses were not supported. So that's good. This is transparent. This is good. So here they're talking about all the things they found. They're saying this supports and extends the scope of this particular theory. And now here they're going to go and they're going to be connecting their research to past findings. So they're saying past media research has tended to focus on teen boys' self-socialization into hostility, aggression, and violence. In our study, tenderness, not hostility, varied most by gender. So they're saying we found something different. This could be a measurement issue. Maybe. Our study extends research on restrictive emotionality into media use and effects. So they are linking. Here's another one. For example, past studies linking tender emotions to prosociality or restrictive emotionality to maladaptive mental health outcomes further point to the potential harms of boy selective avoidance. So that is good. They go through and they continue talking about this. But other than talking about the contributions and talking about linking back to previous research, good discussion sections are also going to have a section about limitations. Now, sometimes it gets its own subheader. In this particular journal, it does not. But you can see that they're saying here limitations. So they already talked a little bit about some limitations up here. But this limitation section is really important because it is part of science and being transparent. This is not meaning that the study is bad. They are just saying that these were some things that didn't go well. Usually limitations will be about sample diversity. They could have asked someone, they could have said the measure was bad, so let's see what they said. One is the fact this was an online experiment, and it was clear to the participants that these were hypothetical rather than actual choices for solo or co-viewing. They weren't actually viewing with friends. They were told to imagine it. Then often tied to limitations, sometimes standing alone, will be suggestions for future research. Further studies might examine the dynamic process by which friends actually negotiate viewing choices, or how gendered performance during co-viewing might moderate emotional socialization processes. So they're making suggestions for the future. This might be for them, this might be for someone that does work in the future. That said, our study was primarily interested in this, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so then, well, there's much to learn about this. We can see that this is a first step. Our study focused on this, etc. So that is how things finish up. You will always be able to find limitations in here. Okay, so at the end of a study, there will be some disclosures. So in this particular study, you can see, for example, that the funding, they say this research received seed funding from the Digital Communication Methods Lab of the Amsterdam School of Communication Research. So basically their own department gave them some funding, which is okay. They said there are no conflicts of interest declared, but I want to show you an example where conflicts of interest were disclosed, okay? So in this study, and this is a study of a particular video game, they have acknowledgments, and that this game was called, or this game company is called Wargaming. We are indebted to Wargaming for providing access to the anonymized data. So this particular video game company gave these authors anonymized data on player behavior, about choices players were making, and they ran analyses on them. So they're saying thank you. They also say you can download the analysis code and data set, which is fine. But this conflict of interest is important. The first author has worked as a consultant for Wargaming, this company. The third author works there full time. No work for this research was compensated. The other authors declare that they have no competing financial interest. This is important because let's say that, well, let's look at this study's findings up in the abstract. Okay, they say in this study, which I can't zoom in on very well, measuring influence of one person on another, blah, 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 blah. This is called social value, blah, 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 blah. This article presents a computational model for estimating social value, as well as a validation for the estimation approach in a study involving players of an online game. Let's say that this study said that this wargaming game totally changed people's minds about an important topic. That would be something that potentially could make money for this video game company, right? So in that case, if we said, here are these research scientists that are saying that this game is really helpful, and these research scientists, like this person who works at the gaming company and this person who consults at the gaming company, they might financially benefit if a lot of people are going to buy this game now because it says that it's going to do something really good for people, right? And you can imagine with like medication or a particular diet that financial incentives really, really matter. So when you see a conflict of interest disclosure like this, it doesn't mean that the study is horrible or that we should throw it out. It means that we need to look at it more critically, because we need to assess, like, does it seem like anything was done to promote the company, to benefit these authors? And we're just always looking at it with a really critical eye. So this is important. It's good for transparency that they did disclose this.
So you might be thinking, hey, I know how to read. Why are you telling me how to read? It is important, though, especially for undergraduate students that aren't reading empirical studies all the time, to understand that there is a different way to read these. There's going to be more about this in other module materials, but just briefly. When you are reading an empirical article, you should read the abstract first. Obviously, look at the title too, but the abstract is going to give you a quick overview of the study, its purpose, its methods, its findings. Then you'll want to read the introduction, and then you're going to want to read the discussion conclusion. So you are going to skip over methods and results, because this is going to tell you what the main purpose of the paper is and what they found. if you want to go back, then you can at least skim through the methods to understand how they did it and skim the results. Don't get bogged down in the stats. Look for the plain language summaries that will be at the end of the results, the beginning of the discussion, or even in the abstract itself. There are other strategic reading approaches that you'll learn about in this module material, but this is just an idea for how to start.
So when you're taking notes on a study, don't forget to write down the citation. It's such a bummer when you had a really good study and you forgot to take down the citation and you can't remember where it is later. This just happened to my son on a research topic recently. He was writing a research paper and he forgot to take the citation down, and he could not remember where he got it, and he was really mad at himself. In order to do the proper APA, MLA, Chicago citation, the OWL, that's the online writing lab at Purdue University, you can search for it, is the most reliable place for the proper way to do these citations. There are automatic citation generators out there, but I want to warn you, they're not very accurate. The Google Scholar one is not very accurate. The one at the library, I've never found one that's very accurate. So be very careful. You can use that to start, but check it against OWL Purdue. You want to take notes on what the bigger picture question that the study is trying to address. What's the main idea? What prior research did the authors say has already been done? You want to note down what the major concepts were and what the conceptual definitions were. Then what method was used. I also generally will take notes a little bit on the operationalization, which will be in the methods section. What the major findings were and what the contribution is, and were there any limitations that the author noted. I also generally will take a note on if there was anything unusual about the study that would limit its usefulness for me. So if I was doing a study on teenagers and I read a study on a similar topic, but it was on little kids, I would definitely take a note so that later I would remember that the findings from the study on little kids may or may not be similar to the study on teenagers. And also I take a note about how I think this study might fit in with other studies that I'm looking at. So evaluating the credibility of studies is a big deal. So here are some tips. First, does the author have an academic affiliation, and particularly at a university that you've heard of? I don't want to be elitist. There is good research that takes place all over the world from people not affiliated at universities, but being affiliated at a university is a quick credibility guide. So do a quick Google search for the author's name. They should have some sort of official university web page. Also, you can look, does the author have other publications in this area? I read a study recently on a particular medical topic, and then I searched for the author, and the author was like a historian of poetry. And I'm like, why are you writing this medical study? Is the journal from a reputable publisher? That can be hard to judge, but you can use the Ulrich's Web or the SkyMago to help you determine that. Does the journal use peer review? And you can find this out when you're looking at an article. You can click, there will be a link that's like about this journal or journal information section, and it will definitely say if it is peer reviewed or not. It's super important, as we discussed before. You also want to look at the funding source. This is a big deal, and studies will always have a disclosure about any affiliation or money that a researcher has taken from a particular organization. Now, studies that are funded by government agencies or well-established foundations are probably more credible than those funded by an unknown or biased source. So for example, if a study finds that chocolate makes people happier and it's funded by the Chocolate Makers Association of America, you should be a little skeptical. I just saw a study last week that was about a particular oxygen therapy for a condition. And it was like, this therapy cures it, it's amazing. And then you look and you see that the authors all work at a private company that sells the machine, this oxygen machine. So it's important to look at this always. So conflict of interest is when there's a situation where a personal or financial or professional interest could potentially influence or bias or compromise judgment. And so this is really important. And conflicts of interest can compromise credibility and trustworthiness of research. And so researchers are obligated to disclose their conflicts of interest. When they submit to a journal, it asks if they have conflicts of interest, like who do they work for, who funds the work, etc. So this is absolutely required. And you will see this in articles, usually at the bottom or the top, about where the researcher works for and who funded the work. And so it's really important to pay attention to this. If you're reading a study about how drinking wine every night makes you happier, and you see that the researcher works for the Winery Owners Association of America, that really, really matters. So if they're working for an organization in particular, this makes it harder for them to be unbiased. This does not mean that the study is absolutely bad. A lot of organizations and companies do fund research. Meta, Google, Disney, all these companies fund research scientists to do research, but the researchers are supposed to be unbiased. It just means when you see that something was funded, you just have to pay more attention. And that you have to see that researchers took efforts to be independent from the funding agency. You also want to think about the research design. Was it appropriate for the question? Did they try to minimize bias? You look at the sample. Is the sample representative of the population that they're arguing? Is there a match between the sampling frame and the actual population that they want to say, that they say that they're making a case about? Like, for example, if they're making an argument, this is a classic one, about romantic couples, and they only did an experiment on college students. That's not to say college students and their romantic lives aren't important, but if they had a finding that was just in college student couples, is that necessarily going to apply to how your grandparents resolve conflicts? Probably not. So, or if it was only on a particular race or ethnicity. So you just want to look at it. Is the sample sufficient size? And we learned a lot about that. You want to make sure that if it's an experiment, that there's at least 20 in each condition. And if it's a survey, that they talk about how they actually determined the sample size based on doing a sample size calculator. That information should be in there. You want to look at their data collection. Was the data collection appropriate? You look at the analysis. They should be giving you as much information as possible about the statistics, the effect size, etc. And the researchers should definitely note limitations. It is an orange flag if they didn't note any limitations. Basically, you want to make sure that studies that are transparent and give a lot of information are going to be more credible, because they could be replicated and they're being upfront about everything that they did. So there are many, many, many strategies out there for evaluating information. I think there's probably like 10 or 15 that I've heard about. But two that we're going to focus on now are ACT UP and SIFT. So first, with ACT UP, it's a way to critically approach information consumption. You're trying to be active in questioning, identifying what is the dominant narrative, what are the hierarchies of knowledge, and who is an expert and why. And so with ACT UP, it's an acronym here. Author is who is the source. Currency is it new? When was it created? Truth is, can you back this up in multiple places? And various other credibility checks that you'll read about in other material in the module about does it seem truthful? Is it unbiased? There's really no such thing as being completely unbiased, but is the purpose of the source known? Do you understand who funded the research? Can you look into any conflicts of interest? And we'll talk more about conflicts of interest in a minute. And then privileged. Most scholars are white and male cis-het folks, and so can you find a variety of sources writing on the topic? SIFT is a method. It's a 4-step method: stop, investigate, find better coverage, and trace claims to assess the accuracy of a source. And this is to help when you encounter information in the world. So before you share or use a source, stop and ask yourself if you know and trust the source of information. Don't share it or use it in your work until you know what it is. Investigate the source. What's the reputation of the author or the source? What does Wikipedia say? What do other reputable sources say? Can you find trusted coverage? Are there better sources that corroborate the information? And then trace the claims, quotes, and media back to the original content.
Okay, we've talked a ton about how you evaluate research directly, how you read an empirical study, how you check if a journal is credible, how to look at funding sources. But here's the thing. Most people in their day-to-day life aren't encountering research reading the original study. They're encountering it in news headlines or in social media posts or someone telling them something. And when research travels from the original study to a news story, it's very common that important details get lost or distorted along the way. So we need to talk about science journalism and what's important to look out for. I'm going to give you this example of a study from 2015 from this guy named John Bohannon, who actually was at Portland State University at the time. In 2015, newspapers around the world ran stories about his study. The study found that eating chocolate helps you lose weight. So people hear that and they love it, right? They're like, great, this sounds wonderful. But this was a completely faked study. This science journalist, John Bohannon, who also has a PhD, intentionally designed a real but extremely flawed study. Like, it was technically an experiment, but the study only had 16 people. He measured a ton of different outcomes, which basically he was fishing for results. If you have a lot of different outcomes, something's going to look like it was statistically significant just by chance. He submitted it to a journal and it got published. Something happened in their peer review process that somehow people did not catch on that this was a really flawed study, probably that has some signals about the quality of the journal. But then after it was published, this guy, John Bohannon, sent out a press release, and news organizations around the world picked this up. And a ton of news outlets, ran the story without ever contacting Bohannon to ask any questions. Reporters didn't ask about the sample size. Not a single story he saw actually reported that there were only 16 people in the study. Nobody quoted outside researchers for a second opinion. So his whole point was to demonstrate how easy it is to turn bad science into big headlines. And so that is a lesson for us in why it's really important to pay attention to the details. So one aspect that trips people up is the idea of statistical significance versus practical significance. In everyday English, when we say something significant, we mean it's a big deal. Like that was a significant event in history, right? But in statistics, significance has a specific technical meaning. It means that the results are unlikely to have occurred just by random chance, okay? This does not mean that the effect that happened, like for example, eating chocolate on health, is large or important in a practical sense, or that it's a cost-effective thing to do, right? Like there might be an effect, but it costs $10 million to run that particular thing or treatment, and people gain 3 days in their life. Is that worth millions and millions of dollars? So imagine there was a study that said that people who eat a particular food lost a statistically significant amount of weight. But what if that weight loss is 1/10 of a pound? It's statistically significant. It's unlikely to be due by chance, but is 1/10 of a pound meaningful in real life? Probably not. So news stories will often say significant without explaining how big the effect actually is, because in terms of getting clicks or getting people to pay attention, saying scientists found statistically significant but practically tiny effects doesn't get clicks. So when you see significant results in a headline, ask yourself, significant in the statistical sense or significant in this actually matters, okay? Similarly, correlation does not equal causation. We've talked about this a ton in this class. Science reporting classically will use language that implies causality. So it's not as exciting to say may be associated with or could be linked to. It's much more exciting to say doing yoga causes cancer. So if you see words like cures or any sort of extreme language, that is a red flag. But you need to ask yourself, was this an experimental study? Was this a survey that found a correlation? So if it's a survey that they found people who do yoga tend to have lower cancer rates, there's a million confounding variables. People who do yoga might eat differently, exercise more in general, have better access to healthcare. So yoga might have nothing to do with it. So remember that only experimental studies with randomized design and control groups can show evidence of causation. We will talk more about that when we get into the experimental module, but just a little preview. So you're going to learn that there's 3 things needed to establish causality. First, association. The independent and dependent variables have to be related to each other. And we'll learn more about this later, but control groups help to establish this by isolating the effect of the independent variable. So if one group got a treatment and the other didn't, and there's a huge difference in the group that got the treatment, that control group helps us know, like, yes, it was the association between that independent and dependent variable that mattered here. Temporal order, often called time order, this means that that cause had to come before the effect. So, for example, if you say Instagram makes people depressed, well, did you know that they used Instagram before there's any evidence that they were depressed? Maybe they were depressed, so they're using Instagram more. We don't know unless we actually have evidence that the independent variable came before the dependent variable. And in studies that are experimental that actually manipulate the independent variable, like give some people a treatment, give some people not the treatment, then it's easier to say, yes, I know the temporal order. And then the last one, non-spuriousness. This is the idea that the relationship wasn't caused by some third variable that you didn't account for. Random assignment in an experiment, which we will talk more about, helps to establish this by making sure that any differences between groups are due to chance, not confounds. So we're going to learn more about this, about well-designed experiments, but when you are encountering research studies in the news, be very, very cautious if they claim causality, if they haven't met these requirements. Another thing that comes up in science studies in the news is this miscategorization. Studies that are done in petri dishes or with mice get reported as if they are applicable to humans. So if you see a headline that's like, scientists discover that green tea destroys cancer cells, that sounds amazing, right? We're so excited. But if you actually look at the study, that happened in a lab dish. Someone put green tea cells into a molecule, like a little dish with cancer cells, and there was some sort of attack. That doesn't mean it would happen in the human body. So we call this in vitro. It's like in vitro fertilization outside of the body. They grew cancer cells in a dish, put green tea extract on them, and the cells died. So in a dish, a lot of things can kill cancer cells. Coffee kills cancer cells in a dish. Alcohol kills cancer cells in a dish. That doesn't mean that you as a human drinking off coffee cures cancer. The human body is way more complicated than a petri dish. Similarly, studies that are done on rodents, mice, rats, hamsters, gerbils get reported as if they are directly applicable to humans. But a lot of things that work in mice or rats don't end up working in people. It's a huge, enormous jump. So we have to be really, really cautious because people will see these things like hydrogen peroxide killing cancer cells, and then people will drink hydrogen peroxide as an alternative therapy. This is genuinely dangerous. So this kind of misreporting really, really does matter. So when we're thinking about this, the bigger the life change you're considering based on something that you read, the more careful you should investigate the science behind it. If you read a headline about dark chocolate helping something, well, okay, you ate some dark chocolate, not a big deal. But drinking hydrogen peroxide versus doing chemotherapy based on a study in a petri dish, that's not a great idea. So when the stakes are high, you need to go back and look at the original study and see, was it in vitro? Were there rodents involved? Was it correlation or causation, etc.? So you want to be using the credibility frameworks as well as you're looking at this, asking questions about, was the study peer reviewed? Who funded it? Did outside experts weigh in? Was this statistically significant or practically significant? Was it correlation or causation? Who was the subject it was done on? The more of the tools you have, the harder it is for you to be misled.